$61,000 of river gold, $6 billion in market value. Nobody ever went to prison. March 19th, 1997. The jungle of Borneo. A helicopter lifts off from a small airstrip in East Kalimantan, bound for a drill site the world has come to know as Busang. 20 minutes into the flight, one of its seats is empty. The man who is gone is Michael de Guzman, the geologist who ran the Busang project for a Canadian company called Bre-X Minerals. Days earlier, he had been summoned back from Toronto to explain why Busang, believed to be the largest gold deposit ever found, appeared under an independent drill bit to contain almost no gold at all. A body is recovered 4 days later. That empty seat is the black hole of this story. Roughly 40,000 people lost their savings. No court anywhere ever convicted anyone of anything. How a penny stock from a Calgary basement reached that altitude, and how the answer to Busang was buried in a jungle, in a helicopter, and in a courtroom that acquitted the only man ever tried, that comes next. David Walsh incorporated Bre-X Minerals in Calgary in July 1989, and according to CBC reporting, ran it out of his home, a penny stock trading around 30 cents, run by a man who by June 1992 was personally bankrupt. To become anything more, it needed a piece of ground and a geologist the market could believe. In the spring of 1993, Walsh acquired both. The ground was a jungle concession in East Kalimantan called Busang, bought, according to the Globe and Mail, on May 3, 1993, for roughly $80,000. The credibility came through John Felderhoff, the Dutch-born co-discoverer of the Oak Teddy deposit in Papua New Guinea. Real pedigree. Felderhoff brought in his own project manager, Michael de Guzman, a Filipino geologist who had spent years fighting for recognition in an industry dominated by the majors. The first holes came back empty. The license was set to expire on December 18, 1993, and the money was gone. If the next hole missed, the story ended before it began. Then, days before the deadline, de Guzman told Walsh he had seen the location of the gold in a dream. In hard rock exploration, targets are chosen by structural geology and geochemistry, not in dreams, but the alternative to the dream was to walk away. They moved the rig to the spot he indicated. The hole struck gold. It would be 3.5 years before anyone understood why. In October 1995, Bre-X announced an initial estimate of 2.7 million ounces. What followed was not a discovery. It was an inflation. 30 million ounces, then 60. By early 1997, the engineering firm Kilbourne was signing off on 70 million, roughly 8% of the world's known gold supply, if it were real. Felderhoff, to Fortune magazine, floated 200 million. Never confirmed by the company, but in print, and the market read it. In April 1996, Bre-X listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. On a split-adjusted basis, the stock peaked at $286.50, disbursing from 30 cents, a rise of nearly 1,000-fold. Market capitalization crossed 6 billion Canadian dollars. In December 1996, according to Trade Press, Lehman Brothers rated it a strong buy and called Busang the gold discovery of the century. And the buyers were not gamblers. Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan put in roughly $100 million. The pension funds of Quebec and of Ontario's municipal workers followed. Beneath them, ordinary Canadians bought it for their retirement accounts, trusting that if the Teachers' Fund owned it, it was real. There would eventually be roughly 40,000 of them. What was actually happening at Busang was invisible from Toronto. That was the design. Mineral exploration runs on one link of trust. The rock in the sample bag is the rock that came out of the hole. Break that link, and the laboratory measures whatever you put in the bag. At Busang, according to the finding later signed by the auditor Graham Farquharson of Strathcona Mineral Services, that link was broken. The gold in the sample bags had not come from the drill core. It was river gold. Reporting adds the rest, panned by hand by local miners, bought up, and sprinkled into the crushed samples at ratios chosen to look plausible. The work, it is alleged, of de Guzman and his field team, the earliest flakes shavings from his own wedding ring. all of it attributed. No court ever ruled on any of it. The total estimated cost of the gold used over 2.5 years was around $61,000. That is the input. $61,000. The output was 6 billion Canadian dollars of market capitalization. Between input and output sits one procedural choice. Bre-X crushed its core samples on site before shipping them for assay. Once a core is powder, it cannot be reinspected. 16,400 samples, according to the Strathcona report as quoted in contemporaneous press. Every one of them tampered. An industrial operation. And it worked. Justice Peter Wren would later write that the tampering was so sophisticated that consultants, suitors, and analysts were all fooled. To see the fraud, you had to be at the drill hole. And the only people at the drill hole were the people doing it. The one power that might have punctured it, the government of Indonesia, intervened in 1996, but not to check the gold. Jakarta blocked Bre-X from developing Busang alone, and an ownership war followed inside the family of President Suharto. The son hired by Bre-X as a consultant, the daughter allied with rival Barrick Gold, the fixer, Bob Hassan, brokering the split announced on February 17, 1997. Indonesia 40%, Bre-X 45%, Freeport-McMoRan as operator 15%. Buried in that deal was the detail that ended everything. As operator, Freeport had the right and the obligation to check the ground itself. What its drills found would put one man on a helicopter 9 days later. As due diligence began, Freeport's geologists drilled what the industry calls twin holes, roughly 1.5 meters from Bre-X's originals. Same rock, same depth. If the gold was real, the twins had to hit it. Bre-X had claimed more than 4 grams of gold per ton. Freeport's twins returned hundredths of a gram. No gold, 1.5 meters over. Freeport's results landed on March 10th. On March 12th, Chairman Jim Bob Moffat telephoned Toronto, where the industry's largest convention was underway, and Bre-X was the star of the floor. According to Maclean's, Moffat said, "I hated to interrupt their joy. I informed them that they needed to get somebody back to the job site because we had run into difficulties." Somebody meant one man. Michael de Guzman, in Toronto for the convention, was dispatched back to Indonesia to explain in person. The gold was gone. It had never been there. On the morning of March 19th, he boarded the helicopter for Busang, a routine flight he had made many times. 20 minutes in, he fell from the aircraft. A body was recovered 4 days later. Bre-X announced the death as suicide, citing hepatitis B and recurring malaria. Handwritten notes were found in the helicopter. Their contents were never released. The body was cremated before independent confirmation. The identification was never independently verified. In the years since, journalists John Macbeth, Suzanne Wilton, Jennifer Wells have reported murder theories, faked death theories, alleged sightings. None of it has ever been proven, and it will stay that way. 1 week after the fall, on March 26th, Freeport went public. Insignificant amounts of gold. Roughly 3 billion Canadian dollars of market value evaporated in a single trading session. The Toronto Stock Exchange's computers overloaded twice in 1 day. From Calgary, David Walsh said, "We share the shock and dismay of our shareholders." On May 4th, Strathcona delivered the autopsy. Falsification, as quoted in contemporaneous press, on a scale and over a period of time and with a precision that, to our knowledge, is without precedent in the history of mining anywhere in the world. Days later, the stock closed at 6 cents. Some investors bought the certificates as collectibles. Bankruptcy protection followed on May 9th. The teachers' fund, the pension pools, 40,000 ordinary investors, all holding paper. The story most people know ends there. That is not the story. The story is what happened next, because the machinery of law did engage, and it produced nothing. Not because the system refused to judge, because it had nothing in its hands. The physical evidence was in Indonesia, half a world from any Canadian court in the final years of the Suharto era. The cores had been crushed on site by design, powder from the start. Many of the records had burned in a fire in early 1997, according to the Canadian Mining Journal, and the man everyone pointed to had fallen from a helicopter and been cremated before independent confirmation. On May 11, 1999, the Ontario Securities Commission charged John Felderhoff 8 counts, 4 of insider trading tied to the $84 million of stock he had sold in 1996, 4 of authorizing misleading news releases. He was not charged with assaulting. No one was. One day later, according to CBC reporting, the RCMP announced there would be no criminal charges, ever. Its reasoning: it was impossible to gather enough evidence. The distance between the biggest mining fraud in history and the criminal law of the country where it was listed was 1 day. David Walsh never faced that day. He had moved to the Bahamas in 1996. In May 1998, masked gunmen invaded his home there, and a few weeks later, on June 4th, he died of a brain aneurysm at 52. Never charged, portrayed by investigators as duped, professing innocence to the end. That left Felderhoff alone as the only man ever tried. The trial ran with interruptions for 7 years, 160 days of testimony. On July 31st, 2007, Justice Friend acquitted him on all 8 counts. Felderhoff reasonably believed Busang was a legitimate gold find. He had taken all reasonable care. The commission declined to appeal and acknowledged it had no evidence he was involved in or aware of the fraud. Felderhoff spent his last years near penniless, running a village store in the Philippines, where he died in October 2019, aged 79. That leaves the investors and the arithmetic that closes the case. For 17 years, a class action moved through the Canadian courts. In April 2014, according to Globe and Mail reporting on the court order, it was discontinued. The lawyers were paid 850,000 Canadian dollars. The pool left for victims was $3.5 million. Too small, the court found, to divide among 40,000 claimants. So it was not divided. It was donated. 80% to the Law Foundation of Ontario, 20% to the University of Ottawa, 850,000 to the lawyers, $3.5 million to charity, 0 to the 40,000 people who had bought the stock. One of them, Stan Buell, called Bre-X the scam of the century and founded the Small Investor Protection Association. Bre-X did build one thing: National Instrument 43-101, the 2001 disclosure standard, qualified persons, independently verifiable drill results, an industry's rulebook rewritten in the shadow of a mine that never existed. Today, Busang is jungle again. Locals, according to CBC reporting, still pan the river for the same trace gold that was once bought from them and sprinkled into the samples that made a Calgary basement worth $6 billion. The question was never whether Bre-X was a fraud. Strathcona settled that. The question is who authored it and why no institution on earth was ever able to answer. The man reporting points to fell from a helicopter. The founder died, never charged. The only man tried was acquitted. All reasonable care, the court found. The police said evidence was impossible to gather 1 day after the regulator filed. The records burned. The cores were powder from the start. $61,000 of river gold bought 6 billion Canadian dollars, wiped out roughly 40,000 people, and produced 0 convictions. That is not a failure of justice. That is what justice looks like when a fraud is engineered to leave nothing behind to convict. This channel has covered the other kind, the fraud twice this size, where the man behind it confessed, and a Manhattan courtroom answered with 150 years. That story is already on the channel. So here is the question. If a fraud is engineered so that no one can be convicted, is it still a crime or just a market outcome? Tell us in the comments. Every empire falls eventually. Subscribe to watch the next one.